As I thought and prayed about what the Lord might want us to focus on as we go through this season of Advent and move toward the celebration of Christmas, I was drawn to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. Unless the Lord leads differently, we'll spend the next few Sundays looking at various events and truths from this account that's connected to Jesus' birth. Now, it's a shorter account than the more familiar one that Luke provides for us in his gospel. And it deals with it here from a little different perspective, focusing more on Joseph rather than on Mary. Now, we're not going to get into chapter 2, the more familiar story about the wise men. Chronologically, that probably occurs much later anyway, maybe up to a couple of years after the actual birth of Christ. So we're going to stick, the Lord willing, if the Lord leads this way, we're going to stick with the content of chapter 1. Now we're going to look at several notable things in this chapter. And I wasn't sure really how else to describe them. The word notable means worthy of note, significant, prominent, or interesting. These aren't just run-of-the-mill things, but there's something about them that makes them worth our time to really pay attention to them and to take special note of them. Well, today we're going to talk about a notable family tree. A notable family tree. Now, for most of us, we'd have to admit our family trees probably aren't very notable. They're filled with the names of ordinary people. Maybe people who are notable to us are a few of the more recent individuals whom we know or knew and loved, but maybe nobody famous or nobody with any special historical significance. But some people have been able to trace their ancestry back far enough that they do encounter some well-known individuals. On my mom's dad's side of the family, there's the story that their family tree can be traced back to a cousin of French royalty, a cousin of King Louis XVI. Now, based on his reputation and what happened to him, that may not necessarily be a good thing, but it's certainly notable. And I don't know, maybe that explains why I lose my head over things sometimes. If you don't get that, look up Louis XVI and read about what happened to him. But for the most part, our family trees aren't especially notable for anything. And we tend to look at the list of genealogies in the Bible that way too, as just a list of names that we're tempted to just skim over as we're reading, especially when some of those names can be a little hard to pronounce. And we have one of those lists here in Matthew chapter 1. It actually takes up a good part of this chapter. And it's tempting to just quickly glance over these first 16 verses and move on. But this family tree is a little different, and there's a reason it's included here. It's Jesus' family tree, or at least it's Joseph's family tree. Since Joseph wasn't Jesus' biological father, it means this isn't technically Jesus' ancestry, but it is his legal ancestry. So that's important. It's the ancestry society would attribute to him. And there are a couple of notable aspects of this family tree. Let's begin by reading it. Matthew 1, 1 through 16, and excuse my pronunciations here. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Solomon begot Rehoboam. Rehoboam begot Abijah, and Abijah begot Asa. Asa begot Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat begot Joram, and Joram begot Uzziah. Uzziah begot Jotham, Jotham begot Ahaz, and Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Hezekiah begot Manasseh. Manasseh begot Ammon, and Ammon begot Josiah. Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. And after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begot Shealtiel, and Shealtiel begot Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel begot Abiad. Abiad begot Eliakim, and Eliakim begot Azor. Azor begot Zadok. Zadok begot Achim, and Achim begot Eliud. Eliud begot Eleazar. Eleazar begot Mathan, and Mathan begot Jacob. And Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. So there you have it. Jesus' family tree is notable, first of all, because it lines up with the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, or the Christ. It shows us that Jesus was in the proper tribe and family of which the great promised deliverer was supposed to be part of. As it says at the beginning, he was the son of David and the son of Abraham. Well, that tells us he was Jewish, a descendant of Abraham, a Hebrew. You remember some of the promises God made to Abraham, that he was going to make of him a great nation, and that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him and his descendants. Now that was fulfilled in a number of ways, but the ultimate way that would be fulfilled was through the coming of Christ, through the Messiah, and through what he would do. The world would be blessed. So that's the first significant point, that Jesus was a descendant of Abraham. Then it goes on to point out that he descended from Judah. Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, those who made up the 12 tribes. It had been prophesied that it was the tribe of Judah who would produce the Messiah. So it wasn't through the firstborn son, Reuben, or several of the others that came after him. They did some things that caused them to lose favor with both their father and with God. But even Jacob's most favored son, Joseph, wasn't the one through whom the Christ would come. He gained some favor in other ways, like receiving a double portion of the inheritance, but not concerning the Christ. He was going to come through Judah, and that was the tribe of which Jesus' legally recognized father Joseph was a part, and that Jesus was legally descended from. So there you have another fulfillment of prophecy. It also points out in that first verse that Jesus was the son of David. Now the Old Testament makes it clear numerous times that this Messiah and King would be a descendant of David. It talks about how David's reign would continue forever, that he would never lack anyone in his family from sitting on the throne. And while that was pointing in one way to David's descendants as being heirs of an earthly throne, it ultimately was pointing to Christ, because no earthly king or earthly dynasty was going to last forever. The Christ would be the one who at some point would ascend to the throne of David and reign forever. So the very title, Son of David, that came to be used as a title for the Christ. And you'll notice in the Gospels that there were times when individuals called Jesus the Son of David, confessing their belief that he was the Messiah. So that is very significant in Jesus' family tree, to show that he was indeed a descendant of David. He truly was the son of David. So this genealogical list establishes the legal identity of Jesus. It gives credence to the fact that he could be the Savior the Jewish people had been waiting for and been looking for. But there's another notable aspect of Jesus' family tree. And that's the fact that it wasn't flawless. It wasn't flawless. There were some individuals included in it whom some might look down on as kind of being the black sheep of the family. And there were some skeletons in the closet, some less than ideal situations and behaviors that aren't glossed over in this list. In other words, Jesus' family tree wasn't perfect, at least not in the way that we tend to look at things. For if we were creating or someone else was creating an ideal family tree for the Messiah, we'd have probably left out a couple of these folks or at least, not mention them or mention certain incidents connected with them, but they're here. They're here. Sometimes we leave certain facts out in order to make things sound better. Back to my own family tree. Understand that I had a great uncle who was a very, very good baseball pitcher. He was scouted by major league teams, and one of them at one point offered him a contract. But he refused because he didn't want, as he put it, he didn't want to be put in a position where he could be traded like cattle. So he gave up that opportunity to play Major League Baseball. Now, I could talk about this uncle in my family tree who was this great baseball player and leave it at that. And, that would sound great. It would make a good impression on people. But there's more to it than that. Understand he was also quite the drinker. And it seemed that the drunker he was, the better he pitched. Not sure I would want to stand up there in the batter's box against him when he was in that condition, but that's what they say. The drunker he was, the better he pitched. So sometimes, we can just tell part of the story and can make people in situations seem better than they are. For example, I was reading a little announcement, an article last week about a person that I know, and he referred to how he had been elected to a certain office for a number of years, and then in a certain year he retired. And that sounds fine and positive. But in reality, I know what happened, that he retired that year because he ran for re-election and got defeated. He was kind of forced into retirement. That article didn't really tell the whole story. But this genealogical list in Matthew does tell the whole story. It doesn't gloss over the rough spots. And that should give us that much more confidence in its truth and in its reliability. Well, what are some of those rough spots in Jesus' family tree? Well, for one thing, where it mentions that Jesus was descended from Judah, we mentioned the importance of that. Well, it doesn't just state the fact. It adds a little note to it. It says, Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. It mentions the mother there, Tamar. And it brings up a rather sordid, unbecoming situation. The Bible tells us all about it back in Genesis chapter 38. That Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law, married to his oldest son, but this son is described as a wicked man, and it says that the Lord killed him. He died as a result of God's judgment. Well, you remember the custom at that time was for another brother to take his brother's widow as his wife in order to raise up a child or children in his name. Well, Judah's other son did wrong in how he dealt with that situation, and he ended up dying under the hand of God's judgment too. Well, Judah had a third son that he promised Tamar would take her in to be his wife when he got a little older. But over time, it became evident that Judah wasn't going to follow through on that promise. He had some reservations about giving another son to this wife, maybe beginning to look at her maybe as a possible black widow, that all her sons who married her died. So Tamar, when she realized that, she took matters in her own hand. Judah, in the meantime, he had lost his own wife. He had become a widower. So one day, Tamar knew where Judah was traveling to, and she went and positioned herself at the roadside disguised as a prostitute with a veil covering her so Judah wouldn't recognize her, know who she was. Well, to make a longer story short, the encounter ended up with Tamar being pregnant with Judah's child. And it turned out to be twins, the Perez and Zerah mentioned here in Matthew. And Perez is the one from whom the Messiah would be descended. Now, that's not a very favorable story in a person's family tree. Nobody involved handled it very well or conducted themselves in a very godly manner. But it's what happened. And this genealogical listing not only doesn't avoid it, but it actually kind of goes out of its way to point it out. Now, it does a similar thing when it gets to David. Like we said, it was important that Jesus was a son of David. But notice what it says about David and his son. It said, David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. It mentions the mother again, and another negative circumstance. Remember, Solomon's mother was Bathsheba, not named here, but described as her who had been the wife of Uriah. And that opens the door to remind everybody about another skeleton in the closet. Remember that David committed adultery with Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, and then he plotted to cover it up. And when that didn't work, he arranged for Uriah to be killed in battle. And after he was dead, then David took Bathsheba to be his wife. Now, Solomon wasn't the child that she was expecting with David at that point. That child died as part of God's judgment, but Solomon was born to her later on. But again, it points to an unflattering incident, one involving adultery and murder. And yet here it is, alluded to in Jesus' family tree. Let me point out one other entry in this tree that some people would have considered a flaw, and that's there in verse 5, where it says, Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab, Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. It seems like whenever the moms are mentioned, that it's pointing out something not just negative, but of significance. Rahab was the harlot in Jericho, you remember, the one who hid the spies when the Israelites were coming into the land. She and her family were spared, and she ended up joining in with the people of Israel. And here we see she married an Israelite and is an ancestor of King David, and through him the Messiah. A woman who did something good when she helped out those spies, yes, but a harlot and a Gentile, not Jewish. And the same can be said about Ruth, who's also mentioned in that verse. We know about her from the book of the Bible named after her. Ruth wasn't a Jew. She was a Moabite, but she married one of Naomi's sons, one who later died. And then she went with her mother-in-law back to her homeland, where she ends up marrying a close relative, Naomi, a close relative to Naomi, a man named Boaz. And she ends up being, an ancestor of David. But again, she was a Gentile, a woman of good character, yes, but still not a Jew. And for some people, that would put a stain on Jesus' genealogy, that he wasn't a purebred Jew. But here it is in the family tree. And again, it's specifically pointed out. And there are others we could point to here. Manasseh, who was an evil king, and others. So what should we take away from this truth about Jesus' family tree? Well, for one thing, it reminds us that God can use imperfect, flawed people like me and you. Not everybody in Jesus' family tree was a stellar person, or at least they had their faults, or they had their bad moments where they made some poor decisions. And we can talk about some of the others named here, and incidents where they went wrong. I mean, none of them were perfect, not even Abraham. It's just more obvious in some of them than in others. But here they are, in the legal lineage of Jesus, used by God to help establish the human heritage of the Messiah. No matter what our faults, no matter what skeletons from the past are hidden in our closets, no matter where we may have gone wrong or made poor decisions, God can still work in our lives and use us in bringing about His will and purposes. We may not be the ideal person in our own eyes or in the eyes of some other people to serve God, but He can use us in spite of ourselves. God specializes in using weak and faulty people, those others might not expect or might not have chosen for such a work. So don't count yourself out from being an instrument in God's hand. If He can use some of these folks in this family tree, He can use you. These incidents also remind us that God can bring good and fulfill His purposes even out of bad, tragic, and even sinful situations. Like we said, those situations with Judah and Tamar and David and Bathsheba, those weren't good. And people sinned, but God still used it. Now, don't get me wrong. They shouldn't have done those things. And if they hadn't, God would have worked out his will in other ways, and no doubt in better ways. And these people who did these things, they ended up facing some tragic consequences for their sins. But in spite of sexual immorality and murder and other sins, God redeemed those situations and brought some good out of them. Think about some of the negative incidents in your life. Maybe some where you were guilty of making some bad choices and of sinning, as well as others doing wrong in those situations. Those weren't good. And maybe a lot of negative consequences have come from it that we still have to deal with. But in many cases, we can see where God has redeemed some of those incidents too. I mean, maybe, it was a failed relationship or marriage, but through it, you ended up finding a better person to be with. Maybe you had some children through that relationship who have been such a blessing. Or you've learned some things from going through that made you a better person. If it wasn't for some of the negative experiences in our lives, whatever they were, and it could be a number of things, if it wasn't for some of those, we wouldn't have grown and become who we are now. Yes, those were bad. They shouldn't have happened as they did. But God has used those circumstances in some good ways in our lives. And again, I'm not saying sinful behavior is good, not at all. But God is such a great God that he can even fulfill his will and purposes and bring good in spite of those times when we faltered and sinned, or just when some tragedy struck our lives. I think of a couple who lost their only son, a teenager, in a car accident. Now that's tragic. But sometime after that, partly due to what happened to their son and to fill that void in their lives, they got involved in a ministry to children, and they have touched many, many young lives for Christ over the years. God brought some good out of a tragic situation. Whatever negative circumstances are in your past, even those that may have resulted from your own sin, be encouraged by the fact that God can and probably has in some ways brought some good things out of it. And let's look for him to continue to bless and lead us in the right way in spite of some of those past blunders. If we've repented and been forgiven, let's trust the Lord to help us move forward and fulfill his will in our lives. He brought the Savior out of a very imperfect family tree, and he can fulfill his will and purposes in our lives too, in spite of our past imperfections. Let's trust him to do that.